basically plan a conservation program. And since you're an expert in human beings and an expert in how human beings react to programs, you'll be in a very good situation to help put these sorts of programs together. You can answer questions about how the work is impacted or may potentially impact people. So maybe you'll be doing a project assessment, or you're going to a local community and asking people questions about how they received a particular program. Identifying how to collaborate with partners. So you're understanding how relationships work, you're understanding how networks work, addressing human well-being, and identifying pilot projects or programs. If anyone has any other questions about how conservation and social scientists can add value to these sectors, you can ask me during the question and answer. So before I go on, I'll admit to you that everything isn't completely rosy in terms of doing conservation and social science. It's not like everything's perfectly lined up. As I mentioned in the beginning, there has been a dominance of biologists and ecologists in the biodiversity conservation field. This means that social science is not as well established in the biodiversity conservation arena, but it is getting very much established, and it's growing faster because it's so much newer. This also means that when you go to a conservation biology conference, you might find that 80% of the people are biologists or ecologists, right? So you're going to be basically, you're going to be in the minority, but you'll be in a growing minority, right? So you just have to think about if that's the sort of situation you want to be in. There has been historical funding bias from granting agencies against conservation and social science, but I would say in the last 10 and particularly 5 years, this has more or less melted away with more and more space for social science in conservation. But there's also major methodological and theoretical differences between social scientists and natural scientists that sometimes can make it difficult to work in interdisciplinary teams. This is actually one of the things in the Nature and Society discussion group in the geography department that we like to talk about, basically how can you break past these methodological barriers. It is difficult. I'm not saying it's impossible, because it isn't, because I've done it, but it's difficult. So it's easier to work with an ecologist if you're already an ecologist versus if you're an anthropologist, right? Yeah, but here's some pros. I'm just going to leave it only cons. You have to add in pros too. So again, there's an increasing call for social science. I mean, it's growing. It seems like every research team wants to include a social scientist nowadays. And the funding situation, as I mentioned, is definitely improving. And I'll add that you actually need less money often to conduct social science research. For example, the research that I've done, it generally involves me needing to pay for my travel and my time and potentially a translator, and then potentially a data analysis program, but that's basically it, right? So you're talking about $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 as opposed to some laboratories which can pay $500,000 for a piece of equipment, right? So even if you don't have access to as much money, you don't need as much money. So that's certainly good. I personally believe, and Dr. Coleman might disagree with me, but I personally believe that being a social scientist gives you greater flexibility in terms of where you work and what you work on, right? So a biologist, maybe they'll focus on one type of beetle, and then they're pigeonholed into that. I feel like as a social scientist, I have a lot more flexibility to change topics as opposed to just working on one little thing. And I also can change locations. As I'll talk about in a minute, I've worked in a lot of different places. I haven't had to focus on one country or one patch of forest in one place forever. I'll also say that I personally believe, again, Dr. Coleman might disagree, but I personally believe there's a greater ability to translate your skills between sectors, in particular into the private sector. For example, if you want to go into consulting or management consulting at one point, if you go and you say, I've analyzed programs, or I've analyzed the outcome of programs, that is a lot more of a close link to what some private sector organizations do versus a beetle study, again. If you want to interrupt me and say you disagree, go ahead, by the way. So the number one skill that you need to be a conservation social scientist, you need to be comfortable with people. It doesn't hurt to be charismatic, and it certainly doesn't hurt to be able to talk to people. Because if you're doing field work, you're going to be interacting with a lot of different people from a lot of different age groups, from a lot of different cultures, from a lot of different ethnicities, in a lot of different places. Right? So if you're shy or you feel like you don't want to talk to these people, you just want to stay in your lab, maybe it's not the best thing for you to do. I mean, there's stuff you can do with data analysis. I mean, but that's no fun just to do data analysis, really. It also helps to have particular methodological training. Sometimes natural scientists believe it's just a matter of going on asking people questions randomly. That's not it. If you go out and ask people questions randomly without thinking about all the questions you want to ask and thinking about the way you ask people questions, you're going to basically contribute to bias, right? So it's possible to ask questions in a leading way that you're sort of asking them, and then they can tell that you want them to answer in a particular way, and they'll give you an answer that you want, even though this isn't actually what the actual answer is. Right, so you need a particular sort of training in how to ask questions. You need a training in how to analyze either qualitative or quantitative data. But again, the methods depend on your specialty and focus. They go all the way from surveys, semi-structured interviews, focus groups, doing statistics for the data analysis, etc. After the analysis and the research is completed, it really helps to have strong writing and communication skills. And this isn't necessarily only for writing up a journal publication or report. It's also for if you want to do that, translating things into science, policy and management, right? So if you go to a policymaker and you're sort of giving your presentation and you sort of have your face down like this and you can't really read this thing, and you give them this document, they have no idea what it says because, okay, that's not going to have any impact at all, right? You need to be able to communicate your ideas and your thoughts both on paper and, I mean, this is true generally, okay? This is true generally. These are good things to have, but particularly in social science, it's good to have. And finally, honestly, a graduate degree, postgraduate degree doesn't hurt. Those of you in the BS program, of course, you're getting a very, very good foundation now, but if you want to basically go to the upper echelons of some of these NGOs and in the public sector, at least, in my experience, a lot of those people have master's degrees or above, right? So you just have to think, where do I want to go in my career? And if you want to go all the way to the top, having a graduate degree doesn't hurt. But like I said, BS program, excellent foundation for that graduate degree. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about myself now that I've talked a little bit about my field of inquiry. My undergraduate degree was from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I unfortunately don't have a map with that colorful line drawing between here and Singapore, but I think it's, 20,000 kilometers. I mean, it's about the same, I would say, from Montreal. So it's a long way away, but I enjoyed myself there. I actually met my wife there, which was very nice. And there I got my Bachelor's of Arts in International Relations and minor in Environmental Studies. So from the research that I did there, I did two major research projects. The first, I spent a semester in Belize where I looked at protected area management, basically comparing the management of 3 different marine reserves in Belize, looking at the outcomes of that management. And then I did a major, what you call here, honors thesis project, where I look at sustainable tourism management in Belize and Jamaica. So obviously for the first project, I was in Belize because I was studying abroad. For the second project, I used some of my data from Belize and also went on a special trip to Jamaica to gather data. All of you know where Belize is, right? I mean, it's a long way from here, but you know. It's a very small country. It's in Central America, next to Honduras and Guatemala. Okay, anyway. Master's and PhD very quickly, because I'm going to talk about my research at more length in the next slides. The master's, it was in public policy, with a specialization in global policy, but a research specialization in marine protected area management and governance, which I'll get into. And my coursework training ran the gamut between program analysis to policy analysis, environmental policy and management, conservation biology, GIS, and economics. So very interdisciplinary there. Similar for the PhD, it was in environmental science and policy from Duke University. Focused on marine ecology and policy, political ecology, qualitative methods for my coursework. Before I talk about my, actually let me go back one. So you might be wondering where this picture is here, where it was taken. This actually has nothing to do with any of these programs. I have it here on the slide. This was actually taken when I was in Antarctica. This is me standing on some lava rocks with Mount Erebus in the background. I was down in Antarctica for about 4 months. I just thought it was a cool picture. It has nothing to do with any of this here. Okay, so before I talk about the research projects I did, very quickly I'll talk about my teaching background. My teaching that I've done has had some overlap with when I was in graduate school and undergrad, although not necessarily exclusively, because I've done teaching at other times also. Mostly focusing on outdoor experiential education, looking at going from years all the way from grade 4 all the way up to university. My philosophy is that I think it's best when people get out into the field and they get engaged and participate in their own learning, and that they have time to reflect on that learning after they're done. So not just say, okay, this is the end of the seminar, all of you get out. Maybe you spend some time thinking about what this knowledge meant to you, for example. Teaching experience, a lot of places around the world. Scuba instructing. I'm a dive instructor, so I've done some scuba instructing in Belize, Eastern Caribbean for summer. I was based off of a dive boat, San Diego and Thailand. Boston, Massachusetts for 3 summers. I taught marine biology and ecology to 4th through 8th year students. When I was in Antarctica, I led some tours onto historic huts of Scott and Shackleton that were 15 kilometers away from the base, and also led glacial walks and glacial camping tours. In Durham, North Carolina, and Beaufort, in concert with my graduate degrees, looked at international conservation and development, social entrepreneurship, and southern history. Southern, in this case, looking at the southern United States. And then in Portland, Oregon in 2011, I was basically mentoring students on environmental management and looking at how Portland, Oregon as a city deals with urban planning, waste management, etc. So for research, as I mentioned before, I felt like I've had a lot of freedom to change topics somewhat. Research, it's gone from marine protected area management, governance, and financing to international biodiversity policy and work on the Convention of Biological Diversity, called the CBD, and then some conservation program evaluation and some strategic planning with conservation NGOs. So my emphasis all along has been trying to do work that actually has an impact in the real world. Publications are great, good to have in my CV. The NUS's committees, they care about this sometimes, okay? But, most publications, I think the median number of citations is 0, right? So if you go through your whole life and that's all you've done, what have you really done? You have a good CV, I guess. That personally has not been my number one emphasis. I've always tried to find projects or looked for projects where it has an applied emphasis and it's working to improve conservation practice. So I'm one of those people who I mentioned in the beginning that, they're interested in doing things that make a difference. To do this, I've tried to connect my work with the work of non-governmental organizations and the public sector and community stakeholders. I have not yet had an explicit chance to work that long with a private sector organization on the stuff I've done, although I certainly would be open to doing that. So this type of work has taken me literally all around the world. So I've done conservation and social science in Belize, Brazil, Croatia, Jamaica, Panama, Fiji. It's a lot of places. But like I said, it's often in close concert with local partners. That's my preference. It's very, also logistically, it's very difficult to show up in a place and try to do social science research without having some sort of linkage. Like having a linkage can in certain circumstances lead to bias, but more often than not, it allows you to connect with people you need to talk to get the data you want to get. And of course, now I'm in Singapore. I mean, I'm standing here, so you know that. So just to talk a little bit in more detail about some of the work that I've done, I'll move past my undergraduate and start with my master's. My master's degree was basically focusing on marine protected area management, governance, and financing. So during the summer between my first and second year, I was working with WWF International based in Switzerland, and I was looking for a master's project, basically a master's thesis. They connected me with all these microphones everywhere, I have to avoid. They connected me with a WWF office in the Mediterranean called the WWF Mediterranean Program, that then connected me with a local organization called SUNCE that was working with the Croatian government to help set up a management plan for a protected area and help basically establish this marine protected area. So for my master's project, I worked with the WWF Mediterranean Program and SUNCE to develop a report basically giving suggestions on the governance of the protected area and how to sustainably finance the protected area. And this was, I hope, it was particularly useful because in Croatia the pattern had always been public management, that is the government directly managing the protected area. I mean, this had to do with its history of communism, but it was coming out of communism. They're looking for alternative governance models. So I helped them think through some of the possibilities. I looked into best practices and thought about possible management and governance frameworks. In terms of financing, again, they'd usually done public financing, which is just the government giving money directly out of general tax revenue. But again, they were thinking about what else can we do in terms of fees and taxes and, diving fees, whatever the case may be. So my fieldwork in this, there was a lot of document analysis. There was a lot of phone calls and conversations. I was taking courses my second year, so obviously I can't spend a huge amount of time overseas. But I was able to spend 2 weeks in Croatia on Lastovo, basically interviewing, doing semi-structured interviews and surveys with people associated with the protected area, all the way from private sector people setting up tourism businesses to people in government, to people working for the NGOs, to community members. So basically took that information, came back, analyzed it, and then put together that report on an innovative governance structure and some financing mechanisms for the park. I'm not sure, I can't recall if I didn't put in a slide actually detailing the results, but just very quickly, what I suggested was co-management arrangements, so basically bringing in public sector, private sector, NGOs, and community members on a 12-person committee to manage the park, which had never been done in Croatia before. And then for financing, there were some suggestions such as fees for yachting, mooring of yachts, fees for trash disposal, and also a tax, an eco-tax based on whoever stays on the island at the hotels. They pay a $2 eco-tax that goes into a protected area management fund. So for my PhD, I again tried to connect up with a conservation organization, and for this one I connected up with Conservation International. So Conservation International is a pretty large international environmental NGO. They actually have a base in Singapore, a small office in Singapore. I think their yearly budget is somewhere in the range of $100 to $200 million. I'm not exactly sure. But I mean, they're pretty big, and they were running this program called Marine Management Area Science Program, which was basically a marine science program run in 4 main countries, Belize, Brazil, Panama, and Fiji, doing projects on marine protected areas and looking to turn that science into management and policy changes. So my PhD was essentially, more or less, I mean, there's slightly differences, but more or less a project or program evaluation. So I basically looked at how was the program designed, how it was rolled out, how it was implemented, what were the factors that led it to be more or less successful in each place, what allowed the science to be turned into management and policy, and why were these factors contributing factors or inhibiting factors. So I basically spent over a year traveling and doing in-depth interviews with almost everybody associated with the program. So in the end, I had talked to 120 different people, right? So that's a lot of talking and a lot of different sectors, and I had to, even if someone was rambling on, I had to be polite and just smile and listen, right? That's social science for you. Yeah, so I was basically traveling to each of these countries, Belize, Brazil, Panama, and Fiji, and the headquarters of the program, which was in Virginia, United States, all while based out of Beaufort, North Carolina. For the second phase of the program, this also included working with two consultants with over 30 years of work experience each from Mexico and Norway to analyze a different aspect of the program. So that was both a learning experience, but I also think I added a lot to their work as well. So I see it's already almost 7:40, so I won't go too much into the details about what I found in my PhD. It actually varied a lot by country, and the factors were country-related factors, project-related factors, and factors related to the donor framework. I can talk to you a lot more about the results by country if you want to come to me and ask. But I'll mention that these results were returned in a very iterative and applied fashion, right? So one of the things that I got involved in is in creating a science to action guidebook. So I mentioned to you that one of the things I was looking at is how science is translated into policy. And this actually ended up being the topic for a guidebook that CI published and that I had a large hand in putting together. Basically a guide for scientists to influence decision making and a guide for decision makers to listen and to use science. So it's basically trying to help cross that boundary between science and policy, which can be harder to cross than you think, and I'm sure some people in this room know that very well. Besides the PhD, there was 5 evaluative reports that I helped write or wrote and returned to Conservation International or to other groups in the field. There was multiple workshops talking about the lessons learned, trying to think about how to improve future programs, etc. And 3 publications. Again, this was not my primary aim, but 3 publications and counting with some others in review now. If you're interested to read more about the process of doing my PhD, I actually am just having a paper published hopefully soon. I just received the proofs, so hopefully the next month or so, about traveling and interacting with basically an NGO to do this sort of applied research. So email me in, I don't know, 2 weeks or a month, and I can probably send along a PDF to you. So after my PhD, I was able to do some work as a consultant with WWF International. Again, I went back to Gland in Switzerland to do this work initially, and then I was doing some of it while based here remotely in Singapore. But for this, I was helping them do their first ever assessment of basically where they were doing marine protected area work throughout their network and what those offices that were doing marine protected area work needed. And another part of that was looking at how much does all the MPAs add up. So the way that WWF is structured like a network. So the offices, they coordinate work with each other, and there's some overriding objectives, right? But it's not like a headquarters business that they just pass down things from the top to the bottom and everyone follows it exactly. So sometimes they actually don't have an idea of what the total of what everyone is working on in any given issue. So this was actually the first time where someone had compiled all the work they were doing in marine protected areas and actually added up what it could all add up to. And this was interesting because WWF really wants to contribute to this, it's basically called the ACHI target, a 10% target. They want to have 10% of the world in MPAs, and they wanted to see how much WWF could contribute to that target. Besides that, I helped organizing a conference focusing on brainstorming strategies to help encourage and accelerate marine protected area establishment. And after the conference, I used the results and things people have been thinking of and talking about at the conference to put together a strategic plan for a marine protected area action campaign that was launched this past October and is currently going on. It's basically called the Marine Protected Area Action Agenda. So while I don't have a direct role in this anymore because it was basically a contracted job, I'm happy to say I had a large part in actually structuring how it would be done. Finally, the conference of the parties for the CBD, 11th conference of the parties were in Hyderabad, India in October, and I helped WF prepare for this with policy briefs and putting together basically a CBD guide for WF offices. So yeah, I basically mentioned these first two things already, but the other thing I'll mention that came out of this work on MPAs with WWF is this action-oriented publication in Parks Journal. You can see it here on the left. It's called Safeguarding the Blue Planet, 6 Strategies for Accelerating Ocean Protection. It has a pretty good list of names and all sorts of environmental organizations around the world on it. But IUCN, this International Union for Conservation of Nature, it's a pretty big intergovernmental environmental organization. They have this journal that's expressly pointed towards protected area managers. So we thought that this would be a very good publication venue, and it has strategies, 6 strategies, as you can see by the title. Again, I'll send this to you if you are more interested. So what am I doing now? Well, like Dr. Coleman, I'm still pretty new here. I think for me it's 6 months total in this job, so things are still in the embryonic stage to some extent. But there are a couple projects that I've been trying to get started and been thinking about. The first is about resilience. So how marine protected areas can build resilience has traditionally been thought about in terms of ecological resilience. So how can we design MPAs so that they're the right size, the right shape, they're connected so that reefs can bounce back from disturbance. But there has been a lot less work on how MPAs can build community resilience. So how can communities bounce back from disturbance and communities bounce back from climate change impacts? So basically the overriding question for this would be, and this is a project I'm doing with someone based at the University of Queensland in Australia, is thinking, okay, how can MPAs contribute to this resilience in the context of climate change? So right now we're writing a paper synthesizing how MPAs can build resilience. We're seeking out basically regional partners for funding and trying to think about potential locations to run a pilot project in terms of having workshops and then setting up this enhanced management plan for resilience building. After that, we hope to develop some sort of memorandum of understanding to integrate the framework into their management toolkit. And after that, once the framework is set up and going, then we can monitor the results and monitor how resilience, basically resilience and climate change, how they interact. So another project that I've actually just started thinking about in the last month. So it basically just have a couple of pages written on this, but I think it might be a very interesting topic, and that's why I'm doing it. And in terms of Singapore and the Arctic. So you might say, okay, Singapore has nothing to do with the Arctic, right? It's thousands of kilometers away from the Arctic. Well, maybe you wouldn't say that because you're all very educated, but maybe somebody would say that, right? But the truth is, the Arctic is under intense threat due to climate change. I mean, the ice is melting, and the ice is melting fast, much faster than people thought it was going to be melting in the past. And this has compelled Singapore to try to become a player in Arctic governance. Now, Arctic governance is already a very interesting case because you have multiple countries basically vying for resources in the same limited space. But Singapore, which is a tropical country vying for a voice in Arctic governance, is even more interesting because it's not in the Arctic, right? So it's basically to some extent, along with other countries like Korea and China, it's sort of upturning some of the governance models that have been present in the Arctic for a while. In fact, Singapore applied for Arctic Council observer status in December of 2011, and in just a couple of months, the decision is going to be made by the Arctic Council whether countries like Singapore and China will be given permanent observer status as opposed to ad hoc observer status. So if they are given permanent observer status, this is a huge in for Singapore to try to have an influence on what happens in the Arctic. Despite this, because it's been so new, little research has looked at Singapore's changing role, what it wants in the Arctic, and also what the Arctic players, how they view a country like Singapore and getting involved, right? And the people who are doing this sort of Asia Arctic research a lot of them are focused on China, which makes sense because China is such a big country with such huge heft, not as many on Singapore. So maybe I can have a place looking at Singapore. So Arctic governance, of course, as I'm sure you know, is marine governance, right? So it fits with my area of interest pretty well. Antarctica, I know that, it's land covered with ice. Arctic is ocean covered with ice that's drinking fast. So there's lots of opportunities and threats there. Singapore is, you can hypothesize they're most interested in the Arctic because of the changes to shipping that may occur. But there also might be opportunities for Singapore to get involved in biodiversity conservation in the Arctic. Maybe, passing along some of the lessons learned. Who knows? No one knows because no one's looked at it yet. So the research questions that I just started to think about would be in terms of the goals and motivations. Why does Singapore want to become involved? What opportunities does not only the government see, but also private sector organizations, maybe Singaporean biodiversity NGOs? They see inherent involvement in Arctic governance. But also, what roles and responsibilities do the Arctic Council member states see Asian observers as having? Do they just want them to sit there and be quiet, or do they want them to actually contribute in some other way to Arctic governance? Or can they contribute in another way, given that it's a tropical country in Asia? And then also, how do the goals and motivations of Singapore and Arctic states in shipping and resource exploration, biodiversity conservation, how do they overlap? Do they overlap at all? Do they contradict? Are there opportunities for Arctic-Asian cooperation? So again, trying to think about the sort of applied aims coming out of a research project, think about what can come out of this in the future. So this is my second to last slide, so I think I'm well on time here. Just some ideas. So when Dr. Coleman approached me, she said, well, we can give people, tell them about ourselves and maybe give them some potential topics to think about or potentially research. So these are just some topics I'm thinking about off the top of my head. I honestly, at least for the first and third, I don't know how much they've been done. They might have been done to some extent, but there might also be room for contributing. So getting back to my interest in protected areas, everybody tells me that Singapore, well, first of all, Singapore doesn't have an official marine protected area. And everybody tells me that it's not going to anytime soon. No, they may be right. They're probably right, but why? What exactly are the political and economic obstacles to Singapore establishing an MPA? You'll say, oh, we know what it is. It's because there's, the space for the port, etc. But I don't think anybody has actually looked at what are the obstacles in the political system, what are the obstacles economically, what are the obstacles spatially to establishing a protected area here in Singapore. Again, what I'm thinking about, maybe it could contribute to this project. What can Singapore contribute to Arctic biodiversity protection and Arctic governance? And finally, there was this maybe a Yahoo poll or some sort of other poll that said Singaporeans are the least emotional and least happy people in the world. Right? Is that it? Something like this, right? So is everybody unhappy everywhere in the whole country? Is this what's happening? Or is it linked somehow to access to nature? Or a green space. So if you have a park you can go to nearby, are you happier than the other people who are unhappy? I don't know, maybe. I would guess. Has anyone ever looked at this? I don't know. Maybe you could. All of you aren't that unhappy, are you, as the poll indicated? You're that unhappy? I hope not. Okay, that's basically it. Thank you very much for your time. So questions and comments means questions and comments, in case anyone has any. Okay. Yes. Go ahead.
Why me? I don't know. But you asked the hard question to Dr. Coleman, so I want to ask you a hard question as well.
All right.
Or maybe it's not a hard question, but much of your work is about working out strategic plans for conservation, parks, etc. How do you actually assess how well your plans work out in the end? Maybe this is just something on paper, and afterwards you go on to the next project.
Yeah, that's a good question. So the question was basically, how do I assess how well my projects work out in the end? I think that's a very good question, because it is the case that sometimes you can get wrapped up in making plans, and then if you're a consultant, you move on, it's less your responsibility how they're actually rolled out. Now, I've never actually had the opportunity to do a systematic assessment of my plans after I put them together, but I do keep in touch with the organizations that I've worked with. So I can get anecdotal information about what's happened and how it's being rolled out and how it's used. I mean, I guess that isn't as good as of an answer as it could be, but that's basically what I've done. That is a difficult issue, right? So you want to make a difference, and you work to make a difference, but then, you know, maybe you take another job, so you can't devote all your time to that one project anymore. Yes?
When you make the plans, do you include some measure of the success in the plan, so you could like incorporate some way of actually assessing how good it is?
Yeah, so you asked basically, do I include a measure of success in the plan? Well, I mean, when you're making, for example, when I worked on the strategic plan with the WWF, my role was as external consultant. So basically, how the project would be evaluated would be basically decided by them in several years after the project has already been rolled out. So I did include some suggested metrics for assessment, but whether those will be used or not is not up to me. I mean, most of what I focused on was in terms of what they should do in terms of staffing, in terms of financing, how they should engage with regional or country WWF offices, what they should think about the strategic vision and mission should be of the program, and then again some metrics for evaluation, but that does depend upon the implementing organization or sometimes the donor, whoever's funding it, to decide upon the evaluation metrics. So that's an excellent question. I mean, it's been established. I know they have some form of co-management. I actually was supposed to have a call with the organization Sonse last week to get more details about what's happened. Unfortunately, that call has been postponed, so I haven't heard an update for a little while. But it has been a more innovative approach to marine protected areas versus what they've done in the past. It's not just publicly managed. There is a lot more community involvement, and that basically gives people more pride in their protected area. If you're really interested in that, hopefully I'll have this call in the next week or so and I can update you. Yes?
In terms of conservation and social factors, like you showed us the whole list of politics, economics, everything, right? I'm just wondering, is there a danger when in the shifting of the focus from conservation, from the objective of conservation towards more anthropogenic perspective? That is, like, it's like when we talk about conservation, sometimes we discuss about the human impact and how sometimes maybe when faced with hard truths that overpopulation might be driving a lot of effects in the world. So how, when it comes to that point, how are we going to tell governments around the world that growth needs to be stuff like that?
I mean, I think I understand what you're saying. You're basically you're talking about a conflict that's been present in the conservation world for a while in terms of the emphasis you put on protecting species and habitats versus, you know, integrating people and allowing use of the landscape and basically in the case of protected areas, can you live in the protected area? Can you use the protected area? These sorts of things, right? So basically the balance between conservation and development. Is this more or less the question? It's interesting that you say that, because there actually, for a long time, there's been a type of project called integrated conservation and development projects, right? So this was a place where they're trying to explicitly integrate conservation of plants and animals and landscapes with securing people's livelihoods and making sure people come out of poverty and use the resources sustainably. In a lot of cases, there's been a lot of conflict, right? There has been a lot of conflict because people want to use resources, and using resources might damage the natural environment. So, is there a risk that if you focus on humans and you think about their needs and think about how they can use the landscape, that we will detract from how many plants or animals can be conserved? Yes, because human beings they often want to use some of those resources in a protected area or in a part of an endangered species. Maybe they want to hunt sea turtles for cultural reasons. Maybe they used to hunt dolphins. Maybe they eat a particular type of fish. But if you don't pay any attention to human beings at all, you have basically two choices. Number one, if you have hundreds of millions of dollars for enforcement and patrol boats and patrol helicopters, you can probably keep people out of the protected area, and that would work, although it would be very expensive. Or if you don't pay attention to people and you care only about the plants and animals and the landscapes, then people aren't going to follow the rules. So you can have a protected area where you say, this is a beautiful protected area for nature, and then people are going to say, well, what about me? So they're going to come in and break the rules anyway and steal things and poach things and violate all the rules anyway. So this sort of balance between strict preservation and conservation and human use, this debate is still ongoing. So there's no easy answer. I personally believe if there's not some room for use of resources, especially when groups used to live inside of protected areas and you push them to the edge, there's a big risk of them violating the rules and destroying the landscape anyway. So in that case, why not just have some sort of sustainable use? Yes?
I want to ask, can Singapore be involved hands-on in their home country, in our home country, in conservation, rather than just being idea generators for other countries like Arctic? The question also being to are there other areas in Singapore to be conserved, rather than what is already conserved, like Chek Jawa, and what do you see as a personal take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say on those questions, I don't have as detailed of an answer as I could on some other issues, just because I'm relatively new to this job and to Singapore generally. I mean, I think the last thought I had in terms of space for conservation, there's not a huge amount of space in terms of land, as you know. There's a lot of people here in a small area. There actually is unused land that could potentially be a nature reserve, but that's currently being used by the military, but that's extremely politically dicey, right? So I personally believe that the greatest space could be in the ocean, right? So even though a lot of the ocean is being used for the port, what are the obstacles to setting up an MPA, and how can we do it in the next 10 years? Anything else? Yes. Right?
From the industry, they're actually lacking the knowledge and tools. What do you mean by minimize the effect? Before the construction, during, and after?
No, I think that's absolutely great. I think getting the private sector involved is actually crucial. In the protected area world, there's been a lot less engagement with the private sector than with NGOs, academic institutions, etc. But I mean, there needs to be more. So it's good to hear that how that's going on. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I think we're out of time. So thanks.